Years ago, I went out with some friends. At the bar we walked into, there were some girls who were friends of a buddy of mine. So he thought, perfect. A bit of social crossover. Only, those girls were already in a slightly different dimension. Holding a conversation turned out to be optional. After the bar, we went to an after party. More drinks, more substances. These were people who, in terms of consciousness, had merely been passing through the bar. After a few hours, I was done. No real contact possible. And the music, even for my fairly broad taste, started to wear on me, until the host made a small miscalculation. He handed me control of the music. I was now the DJ. After hours of minimal techno, I thought, finally, actual music. So I put Remain in Light by Talking Heads on the turntable, crank the volume all the way up, and side A kicks in manic, hysterical, feverish. And somewhere around that moment, I switched into full David Byrne mode. So there I was, stiff, twitching, waving my hands around. Take a look at these hands. I'm a tumbler! While the music sounded like someone randomly hammering on an entire arsenal of arcade buttons. And the heat goes on. And me? I was finally having a good time. One person clearly wasn't. She looked at me, looked at my hands, and slowly slipped into a full-blown paranoid bad trip. Some people claim I was responsible. I prefer to think there were other contributing factors. What happened to her? No idea. After the ambulance drove off, I never saw her again. My God, what have I done? So yes, you can book me as a DJ for all your parties and events, entirely at your own risk. Side effects included. If you're wondering what just happened, that's exactly the effect Talking Heads can have at their most extreme. Because yes, the band came out of the same artistic CBGB scene in New York as Patti Smith, Ramones, and Blondie. But while those bands quickly found their own sound, Talking Heads kept searching. On Fear of Music, you can already hear the first crack. But on Remain in Light, everything opens up. Or rather, everything falls apart first, only to be rebuilt from the ground up. Not from songs, but from rhythm, loops, patterns, repetition. Ideas weren't neatly written, they were stacked. Talking Heads became something like a human sampler. And that's where he comes in again, Brian Eno. Not just as a producer, but as a system. Because where Talking Heads brought the chaos, Eno turned it into a method, controlled chaos. Music that doesn't move in a straight line, but circles, builds, spirals, until you're inside it and there's no way out. Let's break that down. And it starts pretty intense. Don't you miss it?
Don't you miss it? Don't you miss it?
After Fear of Music, the band found themselves at a turning point. Up until then, Talking Heads had worked in a fairly traditional way. Songs written by David Byrne, performed by the band. But that started to wear thin, not just musically, but internally. The band wanted to move away from the idea of David Byrne with backing musicians. They wanted something else, something collective, so they flipped the process. No more songs as a starting point. No lyrics as a foundation. They began with jams, long repetitive grooves, rhythms that kept going. And on top of that, they started building, layer by layer. What worked stayed. What didn't disappeared, until only the essence remained. The result? Music that doesn't feel written, but constructed. Almost mechanical, as if it's assembling itself in real time. And in that process, Brian Eno played a crucial role. Not by adding things, but by shaping the system. He pushed the band to think in structures, in patterns, in repetition. Mistakes were no longer mistakes, but building blocks. And that's how an album emerged that doesn't really consist of traditional songs, but of moving structures. And you hear that immediately from the very first seconds. Don't you miss it.
Don't you miss it? Don't you miss it?
What makes Remain in Light so interesting is that the album really splits into two halves. Side A is energy, movement, Rhythm, this is the band at full speed. Tracks that spin, push, keep going. Built on grooves that repeat and slowly expand. This is where the machine comes to life. But once you flip the record, everything changes. Side B is slower, more spacious, almost weightless. The energy doesn't disappear. It turns inward. What remains feels closer to a drone. Slow shifts, atmospheres stretching out, ideas that linger, as if you're no longer moving, but floating. And it's exactly that contrast that makes the album so powerful. From physical, almost manic rhythms to something introspective, something unsettling. Let's start at the moment where everything is set in motion. This is the kind of opening that, let's just say, doesn't land well in every situation. This is born under punches, the heat goes on. And this is the exact moment where you either lean in or check out, because this is not a traditional opening. There's no clear melody guiding you, no chorus to hold on to. What you get is a rhythm that immediately starts turning. Tight, repetitive, restless, as if multiple layers are moving alongside each other, without ever fully locking in. And over that, you hear David Byrne, not really singing, more speaking, rattling, almost preaching, a kind of manic, rhythmic monologue. Take a look at these hands. The hand speaks. It feels fragmented, as if thoughts are entering and disappearing again. And that's no coincidence. The lyrics on this album are deliberately constructed as fragments, more stream of consciousness than narrative, but the most important thing happens underneath. Everything here revolves around repetition. The band isn't playing a linear song, but a system. Layers that keep returning, small variations, subtle shifts. And that's exactly where something strange happens. Because the longer you listen, the less you try to understand it, and the more you disappear into it. And that's also the point where things can go wrong, because this is exactly the kind of music that slowly disconnects you from reality. Not all at once, but gradually, until you're standing there, waving your hands around wildly, like you are David Byrne, and everyone around you is thinking, what the hell is going on? And honestly, that's exactly the point. The heat goes on is not a description. It's a process. It keeps going and going and going until you're inside it, and there's no way out. And this principle, rhythm as the driving force, only gets pushed further from here. And this is where something else starts to creep in. Cross-eyed and painless. Because what you're hearing here is not just new wave, not just funk. This is where Talking Heads starts drawing from Afrobeat. And that leads you to one name, Fela Kuti. His music wasn't built around songs in the traditional sense, but around grooves, long, repetitive structures where everything slowly shifts, rhythms interlocking, layers moving independently, but forming one whole. No clear beginning, no real end, just motion. And you can hear that principle here, not as imitation, but as translation. Talking Heads takes that idea and pulls it into their own world, tighter, colder, more mechanical. But the core remains the same, repetition as the engine. And honestly, the first time I heard Fela Kuti's music, I went out and bought his entire catalog straight away. And once you hear where this comes from, you start to hear what happens next. And then comes the Great Curve. And this is where everything fully opens up. This is no longer controlled chaos. This is pure overdrive. Everything is moving at once. Guitar lines shoot in every direction, percussion keeps stacking, the groove keeps growing and growing until it almost becomes too much, but it never collapses. It stays right on the edge, as if the band is constantly balancing between control and total derailment. And this is also the point where you, as a listener, no longer have a choice. You have to go with it. This is not music you passively listen to. This is music that pushes you, drives you. I notice it myself. When I listen to this while running, I automatically speed up, without even realizing it, as if that entire machine is pushing you forward, driving you, until you go beyond your own pace. And that's exactly what's happening here. This is no longer a song, this is momentum. And then you flip the record, and then there's Once in a Lifetime. But what's interesting is that the shift doesn't fully happen right away. Maybe the most well-known track on the album, but also one of the strangest. Because musically, this still feels like an extension of side A. That groove, that repetition, that manic voice that speaks more than it sings. But lyrically, something changes. David Byrne sounds like a preacher, as if he's narrating your life back to you, and you may find yourself living in a shotgun shack, and you may find yourself in another part of the world, as if you suddenly wake up and think, how did I get here? Probably how that girl in the ambulance felt. And then comes that bizarre moment. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. It just keeps repeating, as if someone is trying to reassure themselves or convince themselves that everything is normal. And then, water at the bottom of the ocean. And it's one of those lines that makes sense. Of course, there's water at the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, it means absolutely nothing. It's an observation without meaning. As if you're trying to understand something, but are left with nothing but empty statements. And that's exactly where the power of this track lies. This is not a story. This is a consciousness glitching, thoughts repeating, without ever arriving anywhere. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. As if the machine just keeps running a little while longer. After Once in a Lifetime, the album fully shifts direction, as if the machine keeps running for a moment longer. But from there, everything changes. Where the first half pushes you forward, this half pulls you inward. The energy doesn't disappear. It transforms into atmosphere. The rhythms dissolve, the structures loosen. What remains is no longer movement, but space. Houses in Motion still feels like an echo of that groove. But it's looser, more spacious, as if the structure is slowly coming apart. After that, things become more abstract. Seen and Not Seen is barely even a song, but an idea. A spoken piece about identity, about changing yourself, without ever really knowing who you are. It feels distant, almost clinical. And then, Listening Wind. Years later, beautifully covered by Peter Gabriel. Maybe the most restrained moment on the album. A track that almost stands still. Atmospheric, dreamlike. A song that slowly unfolds and pulls you completely inward. This is no longer music that pushes you forward, but music that makes you float, and sometimes even stand still. As if, after all that physical energy, the album suddenly turns inward. No longer, what's happening around us, but who are we really? When all that movement stops. And then the album closes with The Overload. Dark, slow, almost industrial. As if the energy of side A has been completely drained, and only a shadow remains. Remain in Light was released by Sire Records on October 8, 1980, and received positive reviews. Remain in Light is not an album you simply listen to, it's an album that does something to you. On side A, you feel it physically. You get pulled in, driven forward, caught in that constant motion, as if you don't have a choice. And on side B, the opposite happens. That's where you're brought to a halt, pushed inward, as if all that energy has nowhere left to go and turns back on you. And that's exactly where the strength of this album lies. It's not just about music, it's about how we function, about repetition, about patterns, about how we keep doing things without ever really stopping to think about them, until there's a moment where you suddenly wake up and think, how did I get here? And maybe that's what Talking Heads is really trying to capture here. That tension between control and automation, between being aware and just continuing, same as it ever was. But working like this came with a downside. The focus on David Byrne and Brian Eno as the creative driving force created friction within the band. Because Talking Heads was never just Byrne alone. Chris France, Tina Weymouth, Jerry Harrison. They all wanted a voice too. And that tension would continue to simmer. The creative partnership between Eno and Byrne would be pushed even further on their collaborative album My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, where the ideas behind Remain in Light are taken to the extreme. In the meantime, Talking Heads released Speaking in Tongues, a very different sound, more accessible, More band-driven, more song-oriented, less system, almost like a correction. And by that point, Eno was no longer involved. But the impact of Remain in Light goes far beyond Talking Heads. You can still hear it years later. The Beninese singer Angelique Kidjo even recorded a full cover version of the album. And then there's Radiohead. Their album Kid A was heavily influenced by exactly these kinds of ideas. Music as structure, as process, as something that slowly unfolds. And that says everything. This is not an album that stays in 1980. This is an album that keeps working. Same as it ever was. Indeed. Remain in Light is not an album you understand in one listen. It's an album you fall into. Sometimes that works perfectly, sometimes a little less. But it never really lets you go. Whether you suddenly decide to become a DJ in the middle of the night, waving your hands around wildly, or find yourself running faster and faster without even noticing, or suddenly catch yourself thinking, how did I get here? This is music that does something to you. It pulls you in, and then lets you float for a while. And maybe that's the most impressive thing about this album, that it manages to combine two completely different worlds without ever falling apart. So I'm curious, where do you land? More on the side of energy, movement, chaos, or on the side of stillness, space, introspection? Let me know in the poll, and let me know why. I will follow you, if you follow me. And for those who want to dive back into this album, you know where to find it. A playlist link can be found in the description. Thank you for watching. Drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.